This is the fourth video I've done on Des's thinking on the traditional Seventh-day Adventist interpretation of prophecy. Now we proceed to a brief summary of the opposition that developed against Ford. In the 60s and 70s, things went mainly well for Ford at Avondale. He was a popular teacher. He went around the division speaking to Adventist lay people. Through these 2 decades of increasing ferment, he was highly respected and trusted by the division presidents L.C. Naden and R.R. Frame. The presidents of Avondale College and the Pacific Union College did not find Ford divisive, but there were clouds on the horizon for decades, as early as the 1950s, but heating up intensely in the 1970s. Ford became the target of a conservative group in the church made up of several strands, including the Concerned Brethren, a mixture of ministers and laity, mainly at first in Australia. They were upset with Ford for many reasons. One was the inspiration of the Bible, plenary versus verbal typewriter inspiration. This topic affected not only the understanding of the Bible, but also of Ellen White. Did she receive her ideas through vision directly from God? And when she used other people's writings, did she import their errors with it? Were her theology and history errant or inerrant? Were her writings on the same level as the Bible? The perfectionism issue involved issues about the nature of Christ. Was Christ sinless, set apart from men in that respect, or did he have the capacity to sin? Ellen White used the term sinful nature. Did she mean by this that Jesus was just like us, and therefore we could be just like him? SDAs had originally been Arians, denying the Trinity. The issue of the nature of Christ issue has never been fully settled by the Church, and leadership have left a lot of latitude in this important area of belief. The Concerned Brethren were, of course, historicists dedicated to the original Adventist timeline. In the 1960s, the book Questions on Doctrine made great advances theologically on some of these issues, but it's been under constant attack ever since. These concerned wrote about it to Adventist leaders at the General Conference in Washington, D.C., and while in Australia in the 1970s, Ford faced a series of complaints at the SBD in Sydney from Concerned Brethren. Russell Standish, an Adventist physician in Singapore at the time, and his brother, Colin Standish, a teacher in education at Avondale in the 1960s, joined the fray. They were originally concerned about Bob Brinsmead's rejection of perfectionism and the nature of Christ issues. While in Australia, Ford was able to defuse the division's concerns. However, the Concerned Brethren continued to meet with division personnel after the Fords went to America in 1977. As I've said, all of this was recorded in the Standish books, which are online for those who wish to read them. Keith Parmenter, the incumbent president of the division in the mid-1970s, was a traditionalist and therefore understandably drawn to the concerns of the retired ministers. He disliked John and Bob Brinsmead, who'd been agitating on various issues in the 1960s and 70s. Over his tenure as president, he was never interested in progressive ideas about Ellen White or prophecy and discouraged their propagation in the churches. Temperamentally, he was unable to handle stress and pressure. The Fords arrived at PUC fairly unknown in July 1977 to face doubt and suspicion, innuendo and rumour. But Ford's classes and Sabbath school classes were well attended. He soon had an enthusiastic following in America. The next 2 years were filled full for Ford, with teaching classes and taking weekend meetings and weeks of prayer and writing. He was incredibly busy. The Concerned Brethren made a continuous assault on Ford's ministry, reaching over the Pacific. There was a mole in the religion department of PUC. and this person gave them access to the list of Ford's speaking appointments. Wherever Ford went, his opponents had already disseminated thousands of copies of Australian pastor George Burnside's Dr. Ford's Dangerous Doctrines. Back in Australia, the concerned brethren were still agitating to have Ford dismissed, and eventually Parmenter began to capitulate. Once Keith Parmenter stated that Ford would not be going back to Avondale to teach, Ford knew he would not survive. Therefore, Ford felt he had nothing to lose by speaking out. A fellow college student of Ford's in the 1950s, Robert Brinsmead, was a farmer with a meteoric mind and some theological genius from New South Wales, Australia. Brinsmead, called a gadfly on the side of the church, had already been stirring Adventism in Australia and the USA, originally believing in an end-time perfection in the 1960s. In the 1970s, when thinking of debating a Roman Catholic priest, Brinsmead came to see that he'd been wrong in his views of justification by faith and did an about face. Brinsmead did not debate the priest, as he found his views on justification were similar to Brinsmead's old views. By 1979, Brinsmead had seen the implications of his changed views about Christology and soteriology and how they affected eschatology, and he tackled the issues in Hebrews 9. Hebrews 9 teaches that Christ has entered into the most holy place, the second apartment of the sanctuary once for all. Did this entry occur at the cross as the rest of the religious world and some Adventists were teaching, or did it happen in 1844, as SDAs traditionally and historically taught until Glacier View? Meanwhile, Ford was travelling widely in the USA, and Brinsmead's followers came along to his meetings and began asking him questions about Hebrews chapter 9. Because of this and local questions, faculty at PUC asked Ford to take a talk on the problems with the investigative judgment doctrine for the SDA Forum run by the Association for Adventist Professionals. Ford agreed reluctantly, saying it would cause trouble. These faculty members thought he would be protected under the auspices of Forum. 1,000 people attended the Forum meeting on the 27th of October 1979, and soon the tape of the meeting arrived at the General Conference office in Washington, D.C., with a call for Ford's dismissal. In November 1979, Ford was abruptly called out of his classes and summoned to General Conference headquarters in Washington, D.C. There he was given housing and leave to write up his views. Within 6 months, he produced a document of nearly 900 pages called Daniel 8, The Day of Atonement and the Investigative Judgment, also called the Glacier View manuscript. In April 1980, leaders formulated a statement of 27 fundamentals of faith at the 1980 General Conference session held in Dallas, Texas. This list of 27 fundamentals included number 23 on the investigative judgment and gave the administration a benchmark against which to judge Ford 3 months later. Ford's edited manuscript was distributed a few weeks ahead of time to the participants who attended the Glacier View meetings to consider his views. They were required to take time off and read the manuscript, though it was posited later that few actually did. In August 1980, the Fords flew from Washington, D.C. to Glacier View, Colorado, with many other participants to attend the 6-day Glacier View meetings. In the opening meeting at Glacier View in Colorado, held August 11 to 15, 1980, President Neil Wilson stated that Ford was not on trial, but before the end of the week it became clear that he was. Wilson used the Dallas Statement in the opening meeting at Glacier View as the gold standard from which the church was not prepared to budge. Participants were told very clearly that the week would end in consensus, there would be no split vote, their conclusions would agree with the Dallas Statement. 111 administrators and scholars representing the World Church held small group discussions on various topics and reported the results at full sessions. Ford was not part of the committee he did not attend the discussion as his book was considered to be his contribution. He was originally not slated to speak to the group, but after intervention by Heppenstall, he was allowed to answer questions on a number of occasions. Scholars found freedom in expressing their views and initially were hopeful about the outcome. But as the week progressed, their hopes gradually dissipated because of the hardline stance taken by administration in the fall sessions. By the end of the week, designated committees wrote a consensus paper with 2 parts, Christ in the Heavenly Sanctuary and the role of Ellen G. White in doctrinal matters. These were a summary of the week's findings and conclusions and made considerable advances in thinking. Copies of these consensus statements were handed out in the full session of attendees on Friday morning. The Fords were present during part of the final session. After reading both consensus statements, Des turned to me and said, "This is good, I can live with this." The Fords were not allowed to participate, discuss or vote, but the rest of the committee did vote on the consensus statement. After this, the Fords were asked to leave the meeting. As I mentioned elsewhere, Milton Hook looked in the records for a record of the vote and did not find it. After they left, another document called the 10-point statement was presented to the group. A small committee of 6 scholars had been asked to prepare a 10-point summary of differences between Des Ford's position and the traditional view on the investigative judgment. The statement did not compare Ford's position with Edward Heppenstall's position reflected in Fundamental Statement number 23, voted in at Dallas. This was considerably different to the Great Controversy view, which was the benchmark in the 10-point statement. Also, there was very little scriptural evidence in the 10-point statement, and some of the committee who wrote it would themselves have had similar differences with the traditional position. The 10-point statement was not copied and given to the participants of the full session, as were the consensus statements. It was read out from the front, and it was not voted on. A leading theologian stood up and said he hoped this statement would not be used to discipline anyone. He was assured it would not. Only certain administrators knew the second document would be used later that day to judge and discipline Ford in private. Even the people who wrote it did not know it would be used that way. The fact that Ford and his wife had been asked to leave the session while the second document was discussed is most interesting, considering what happened later in the afternoon. I believe I wrote this in 2004, not 2009, and it's interesting because I didn't look at this before I did my history of Glacier View, what I said that's the same and what I said that's slightly different. On Friday afternoon, after the close of meetings that morning, members of the GC Executive Committee Prexad, joined by 2 members of the Australasian Division, met with the Fords. As indicated, the 10-point document was used to initiate the firing of Ford, though he protested that it contained no evidence. Ford pointed out the consensus statements had moved towards his position in several areas, 7 to 10, as I said elsewhere, 7 of them crucial. Ford pointed out that the consensus documents had... I've said that. The church leaders in this meeting did not seem to realise its advances in thinking. One said, Francis Wernick, he would not have voted for it had he known. After this disciplinary meeting, Neil Wilson asked Des to make a list of where the consensus statement agreed with his manuscript. Des wrote the list and gave it to Elder Wilson, and after publishing it in the ministry, these documents were later shelved. During this afternoon meeting, Elder Parmenter read out 4 conditions with which Ford must comply. Ford knew he could not do this, however long they gave him to think it over, and he said so. Keith Parmenter made it clear at that meeting that Ford would be defrocked from the SDA ministry unless he changed his mind, rescinded his views, and made a written statement stating this and associating himself from Bob Brinsmead in the Adventist Review. Parmenter mentioned the offer of some months' wages with expenses for the family's move back to Australia He also said he would offer Des a job in the Sanitarium Health Food Company. In Australia, he did not think it would suit him. Within weeks, the decision to defrock Ford was ratified by a special meeting of PREXAD. The PREXAD action was followed up and enacted in Australia by a committee at the SBD, Ford's employers, by a committee at the SBD of Ford's employers. I think it was the executive committee. Ford was not present at either of these meetings. Many letters were written to the General Conference protesting the decision to fire Ford, including those from religious faculties in their colleges, some of the participants objecting to the way Glacier View had been interpreted in the church papers. It was to no avail. President Neil Wilson said, "What we've done, we've done." Wilson wrote to Ford shortly after Glacier View saying he behaved like a Christian gentleman and his views on righteousness by faith were not unquestioned. It was his views on prophecy that clearly deviated from the accepted teachings of the SDA denomination. In 1980, some weeks after Glacier View, Desmond Ford had his employment as a teacher at an Adventist college terminated because he was at variance with the historicist views of traditional Adventism. He had begun a fundamentalist Adventist, but through the years his study of Scripture, Ellen White, and scholarly works on prophecy, and his interaction with both Adventist and non-Adventist scholars had changed his thinking. Ford believes the Miller movement was of God. Its main contribution was an emphasis on the soon and visible coming of Christ. This was a minority view among Protestant churches at the time. Almost all churches believed in the inevitability of progress. Now Miller's view about the second coming is almost universally held. Seventh-day Adventism has been dogged by its continuing anti-Catholicism, the central theme of its prophetic last-day scenario. Other Protestants have seen that old methods of exegesis were wrong, that Roman Catholics are God's children and part of his universal church, with all the subsequent focus on the child abuse within the Catholic Church. There's no doubt that they have their corruption as well as the Adventist Church. In saying that, I don't mean the Adventist Church has a lot of pedophilia, but I don't know. Above all, other Protestants have accepted that Christ admonishes all his children to love each other. However, Adventists still hold prophetic views which are archaic and isolate them from other Christians. Ford says historicists all through the ages have read the apocalyptic books of Scripture like a newspaper of the day, imposing current events on the last day scenario of the book of Revelation. Time always passes and the old views pass away. Turkey was part of Adventist thinking in Adventist prophecy in the early 1900s, but where is it today? Who in 1844 could have seen the current problems we face today with Islam and terrorism? It was Ford's emphasis of righteousness by faith that led him to see the necessity for reinterpretation of the Seventh-day Adventist schema of prophecy. He realised that eschatology, like soteriology, is all about Christ. And I note, because of the lack of footnotes, that this was not the final version of my article, but I didn't realise that until the end. Thank you for listening.